Rolling. This is the FedSoc Films Podcast,
where we continue the conversation
sparked on film.
Quiet on set.
You want to know what freedom tastes like? It tastes like this beer.
Take one.
This is, in fact, the classic solution in search of a problem.
Action.
That cannot help but be controversial.
Cut. With expert discussion and analysis. With the greatest legal minds on the topic today. The FedSoc Films Podcast. It's a wrap.
When you hear Sam Adams, what's your first thought? The beer or the founding father? If your mind wanders to the lager, you're probably not alone. Not many people know the important role this incendiary rabble-rouser played in the American Revolution. Hey there, welcome to the FedSoc Films Podcast. I'm Ann Hartley, your intrepid host. We created a little film called Son of Liberty, Man of Law, about John Adams and the Boston Massacre trials. But John wasn't the only Adams involved in the incident. I have here with me Ira Stoll to talk about John Adams' cousin, the fiery Samuel Adams. Welcome, Ira.
Good to be here.
Glad to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
I'm a journalist, like Samuel Adams was, and like him, I live in Massachusetts and went to Harvard College, and religion is an important part of my life, although I'm Jewish and he was a Christian, a Congregationalist. And we both believe strongly in freedom. So there's a saying that all first novels are autobiographical. And so I joke with my biography of Samuel Adams that in my case, my nonfiction, my biography was a little autobiographical. But he was a key figure in the American Revolution, which we're all still benefiting from and participating in some ways today. And so I wrote a book about him that came out in 2008, and I'm still happy with how it came out. I was reading it a little bit before I came on here just to remind myself, and it's an amazing story.
Yeah, it sounds like he was quite the interesting figure in the American Revolution. How would you describe the role he played?
Well, the way I'd formulate it is that without Samuel Adams, the American Revolution wouldn't have happened when it did and how it did. We would have been like Canadians, citizens of Great Britain, without full rights for a much longer time. We might have had pictures of the King or Queen of England on our stamps and coins, and we wouldn't have had full representation. We would have been subject to taxation without representation, and we wouldn't have democracy. We wouldn't be able to vote for and choose the people who make the decisions that affect us. So Samuel Adams helped start the American Revolution. He helped win it, and he persisted in it at a time when lots of others gave up. So for me, and I think most people would agree about this, like I don't think it may not be widely appreciated, but I don't think there's a lot of disagreement on this point. Samuel Adams was a pivotal figure in making it all happen, in winning American independence.
Yeah, it seems like he was absolutely everywhere. You know, he was in the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Acts, the Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence. He's kind of. Do you think he's the most influential figure during that period?
I do. I mean, I'm a homer. I'm from Massachusetts, so the Virginians might see it differently and emphasize Washington's role or Jefferson's role, and or even Patrick Henry's role. I mean, I can understand those arguments. The Revolution was a big, long struggle, and lots of people played important roles. From the Boston piece of it, Samuel Adams' role looms large. And I think if you look at all 13 colonies, the role of Massachusetts looms large. I think Samuel Adams was a little bit older, and I think he played a more important role nationally before the Revolution than after the Constitution was ratified. So, Washington was the first president. John Adams was the second president. Samuel Adams was never president or vice president of the United States the way Washington, Adams, Jefferson were. The highest position he ever got after the country was established was governor of Massachusetts, which he served only after serving as lieutenant governor to John Hancock. So I think that shaped the memory of events a little bit. But at the time, he was more prominent. I mean, when John Adams went to London, they greeted him and said, "Well, you're not the famous Adams." And at the time, the famous Adams was Samuel Adams, and for good reason, because he was playing such an important role in writing, in organizing, in articulating the reasons why America should be free.
It sounds like he was definitely an intellectual powerhouse and also a little bit of a sort of influencer, I guess you might say.
Yeah, so influencer, totally. And the technology for influencing at the time was in-person meetings and really printing. The printing press at the time was, I guess, the equivalent today of the internet or the mobile phone or podcasts. I mean, there was this newspaper called the Boston Gazette, and Samuel Adams was friends with the owners and publishers and editors of it, Eads and Gill. And he used to go to the newspaper office the night that it came out and help print it. And he wrote under like an astonishing number of different pen names. So some said it was to make it look like there were more people who agreed with him than if it was all just under his byline. But under all these pen names, he made the case for the revolution. And so those articles were reprinted in other papers around the colonies. And he also had, it was called a committee of correspondence, where he and others would write letters to the different towns in Massachusetts and throughout the colonies, so that news of what was happening in Boston would spread to other places, and news of what was happening in other places would spread throughout Boston. And that really helped knit the colonies together into what became the United States.
It is absolutely fascinating to hear about. It, goodness, it sounds like he kind of pushed things along. Do you think he was being duplicitous and using multiple pen names, or was he just doing what he saw needed to be done?
Well, I think that some of these pen names that he used were from Greek or Roman history, and I think the people who were close enough to it knew what was going on. So he wasn't fooling them. And certainly the British knew what was going on, because once things heated up, there was an offer basically of amnesty for all Americans except for John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who the British planned to hang if they caught. So the British weren't fooled, and it was clear from in-person meetings that Samuel Adams was certainly taking a leading role, although he would also delegate and include other people and let others take the lead when it was appropriate. So, I think I wouldn't fault him for misdirection. There is like a line of historical thinkers who view Samuel Adams as a pioneer. Like there's a book, I think, that where the subtitle is Pioneer in Propaganda. So there is like a group of people who think that the American Revolution was sort of misguided and that it required some devious person to whip up the colonists against Britain the way you'd have to do to get people to complain about something that didn't really deserve to be complained about. But that's not my view of the American Revolution. My view of it was that it was a glorious cause, and that that the colonies were correct in seeking self-government and opposing taxation without representation, and that it didn't require a lot of clever propaganda to mobilize people in that cause, though it certainly helped to have a strong statement of the facts and the reasoning in favor of those ideological causes of the American Revolution, which I think were at the core of it.
Gotcha. Sounds like you're definitely in agreement with Samuel Adams on that matter. So, do you think it's fair to say that he was more than just a rabble rouser, both for the Boston Massacre and the events surrounding that, and throughout the American Revolution?
Right. Well, this is another negative take on Samuel Adams that I find myself sometimes defending against. Like we covered the pioneer and propaganda negative take. The other is Samuel Adams as the kind of leader of the Boston mob, and tarring and feathering people and going in and wrecking the houses of the colonial governor, and there, I think that's overstated as well. There were cases of tarring and feathering, but there's no evidence that Samuel Adams ordered or approved of those instances. And in fact, in the case of the property damage to Governor Hutchinson's house, he distanced himself from it and denounced it. And in any case, Hutchinson himself was unharmed. So until the war started, Samuel Adams was a peaceful agitator who restricted himself to mostly nonviolent, or almost, I would say, entirely nonviolent protest, with his main weapon being his own pen and his voice, which he raised at public meetings, town meetings, and the destruction of property, the Boston Tea Party, the dumping of tea into the Boston Harbor. Samuel Adams gave the order to start that. And, so you could call that a disregard of property rights. But I would say it was in the service of defending the property rights of the colonists not to have taxation without representation. So in that case, I think this idea that it was all the Boston mob rather than legitimate argument for democracy and the rights of the colonists, as Samuel Adams put it, I think it's a misguided criticism of Samuel Adams. Although that's not to say that he wasn't enthusiastic and creative about sort of street theater, whether it was songs or parades or public events, and I think he used those mechanisms very effectively in promoting the revolutionary cause.
That sounds really neat. Are there any particular instances you remember of Samuel Adams inspiring some sort of, I don't know, crazy street party or something?
Well, the Boston Massacre, the funerals of the victims were quite elaborate, and the Boston Tea Party itself was quite an event in the streets of Boston that involved people disguised as Indians marching around. There was a Liberty tree erected in Boston Common, which was a giant symbol of liberty, and they were liberty poles that were erected all throughout New England towns all over. So and the anniversaries were marked. Boston Massacre, the 1-year anniversary of it was marked with orations, and people got together and gave speeches in the churches and at Faneuil Hall, so that these things weren't forgotten. So those are some of those would be some of the ways where, and then they would sing songs. There was a Liberty song that they would sing that I write about in my biography of Samuel Adams, and they had the Congregationalist ministers who were very influential at the time. They would preach sermons about the revolutionary cause, and at these events marking the anniversaries of the massacre. So those would be some of the ways, other than writing, where Adams would stoke the revolutionary cause.
Wow, it sounds like he was really at the heart of it all. Do you think he would be considered a radical in his time?
Well, the British certainly saw him that way. But Samuel Adams himself saw himself not as a radical, but as a kind of conservative, defending the constitutional rights that the colonists had come to North America to preserve: religious freedom, kind of authority of a kind of self-rule, and the liberties that were established in Magna Carta. So, there was something radical at the time about the idea that all men could, even savages, as Samuel Adams put it, could have the capacity for freedom to rule themselves. And for Samuel Adams, that extended even to refusing the gift of a slave. There's something, for the time, there was something radical about the idea of throwing off the monarchy and having the colonies be independent of England, and eventually, that slavery would not be consistent with American freedom. But in articulating that, Samuel Adams saw it as consistent with the biblical idea of exodus from slavery and of all people being God's children. And so he looked to traditional sources to defend these ideas that some people at the time saw as radical. And also he supported, when the time came, once a constitution was established, both the Massachusetts state constitution and the U.S. Constitution, there were radicals who wanted to keep rebelling. Like there was the Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts. That was like kind of a tax rebellion. And Samuel Adams sided against those rebels. And the idea, he thought, was that once you had a representative government that was entered into freely by the people, that should be respected and defended. So, I think that there were certain radical things about Samuel Adams' views, especially by the standards of the time, there are also ways where, even at the standards of the time, and certainly by today's standards, and certainly by his own definition, he would have seen himself as more traditional.
This sounds like an interesting contrast. Definitely not a binary there that you could stick a box over his head. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of the FedSoc Films Podcast. Before we let you go, I gotta ask, what are your thoughts on the beer?
Well, when my book about Samuel Adams came out, we had an event at the Boston Public Library, which was free. And we got a small crowd. Let's just say the C-SPAN Book TV was there to produce the event. And the producer said, well, we never do this, but could you all please gather a little closer in so it looks like Ira has a good crowd? And then I had an event at the New York Historical Society, and that event, there was a charge to attend. I think it was maybe $20 a ticket. And that event was like sold out. We had hundreds of people. It was almost an overflow, standing room only type crowd. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. Was there more of interest in this revolutionary Boston figure than in New York than there was in Boston? And then I realized that at the New York event, even though there was a fee, the New York Historical Society had gotten the Samuel Adams Beer Company to sponsor the event, and there was beer available afterwards for tasting. And so I'm a big fan of the Samuel Adams Beer Company. I'm grateful they provided some of their product for that New York event, and it helps get crowds out for hear about Samuel Adams that the beer exists.
That is fantastic. And where can our listeners find your book if they'd like to look it up?
Well, so the book is Samuel Adams, A Life by Ira Stoll. It is published by Free Press, which is a division of Simon & Schuster, and it's available. You can order it from your favorite independent bookstore. It's available at the big online booksellers. It's in print, and you could get it. You could buy it. You could go to your library and ask for it. It's a widely available book, and I'd be grateful if people bought it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ira. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, folks, for listening in. You can find our film, Son of Liberty, Man of Law, on YouTube, Facebook, or fedsoc.org. That's FEDSOC.org. As always, the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker. That's a wrap.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.